Hi, everybody. Another Thursday night. I have a couple of questions, but there's one I'd like to just make sure I went over well enough. It was Bronwyn Reese's question from Elmer. She says, by its very nature, growth holds a dynamic of a movement towards something, a development. And so there is a sense, perhaps, that it is personality related sense, that we are currently not there yet, whatever that means in terms of our sense of what growth is. That's what she says. Can you talk a bit about the dilemma of not being there yet and our judgments on that as if it were a shortcoming of some kind? Oh boy. One of the dilemmas, I think, in spiritual development or spiritual growth has always been, with respect to humanity, the ability to assess whether a person is spiritual or in some way can show their spirituality, because they have to prove it. And that is a personality-oriented thing. In fact, nobody has to prove anything. It's really not relevant as much as we think it is. But there is a turning point somewhere along the line where you suddenly realize, and I think I mentioned this before, that spirituality is not goal-oriented. It's not even characteristic-oriented. Strangely enough, it has to do with the realm of a fusion or a synthesis between planes or between levels of engagement that, on the whole, from humanity's point of view, humanity doesn't or is quite unable to perceive that blending or that synthesis that occurs in an individual. This is not a negation at all for humanity. We are in a process towards becoming, let's say, different than we are now, hopefully. And I say that because of an honest nervousness in me or in others that perhaps relates to the idea of the personality's version of what spirituality must be. You must be this, you must be that, you must be clairvoyant, you must be this, you must be whatever, you must be somehow extra special in the eyes of others. This is not a rendering of spirituality. This is a rendering of something that relates to process. The process, basically, of a human being moving into a link with other states is related directly to how much energy an individual can handle from other states for the purpose of being helpful on these planes, to help others to become more able to handle more levels of engagement with higher states. It has its similarities to, very interestingly enough, to links between emotional states and mental states. Subtle. If an individual is highly charged emotionally, that doesn't mean they're bad people at all. It means their tendency is to reflexively engage in a manner that relates to how they've been constructed as a normal personality. And then the emotional engagement that they have may be blending with a mental sphere, but also a natural reflex to defend the value of what individual might believe has to be true. This is consistent for most human beings. We all have these aspects of emotion, sometimes disguised in the guise of being intellectually oriented. If you read books on philosophy or books on intellectual orientations towards literature or anything else for that matter, science as well, agreement is not consistent because there is an opening always towards the next level of understanding that might be presented somehow by someone who has come up with an idea, one could say, that is slightly different than the other ones that preceded it. And therefore, a link between a kind of thinking that is different has shifted and broadened an emotional way of thinking or a mental way of thinking into a state that is relatively similar, but just different than what has been thought of before. This is how we've gained access to, one could say, some kind of personal development or material development or human development for over the ages. And this is not a negation of any kind at all, but there is a blending there of an openness towards a thought that might be similar but not quite the same as what was thought of before, or very much different than what was thought of before, or emotionally defended before, which is legitimate, and something raises its, let's say, awareness within an individual so that they can be inclined to talk slightly differently, write slightly differently, paint slightly differently, think slightly differently than was preceding it, or use somewhat similar things than before, but come up with a different angle of how to see things, as many of our scientists have, especially in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as we all know. And what we're really doing there is, if we could see it, is we're blending something different with something that was considered viable previously. It tends to be a slow movement with an actual assessment based on what was done previously being more dominant initially, then eventually that shifting into a different way of understanding and therefore acceptance moving forward begins to broaden out a little bit. Whereas prior to that particular idea, there was hardly any acceptance whatsoever of a new idea because old ideas needed to be there for permanency, stability in relationship to how a community thought. This resembles our relationship very much with our personalities. There is really no negation about slow movement related to spiritual or personality development, but there is a whole lot of judgment related to what should be, what shouldn't be, how things are, and that's the right way versus the wrong way. All of these kinds of assessments, which, by the way, colludes with a similar rendering. I think last time I talked about continuums. Along a continuum, for some sort of basis for feeling comfortable internally. If a continuum moves too quickly, we have a vulnerability to not being able to understand what's going on. For example, technology in the last even 25, 30 years has become a little bit more difficult for some to make sense of if they're used to a different other kind of technology. I can give you an example. I was brought up in the era of radio, where the images in my mind were emphasized and engaged with and cultivated by me, so I understood a radio program that was that was involved with uh, uh, expressing a movie. For example, Lux Radio Hour. There used to be all kinds of movies come on for an hour to an hour and a half or two, but usually about an hour. They were shortened up, and you had images in your mind, and they were talked about. Sounds were expressed on the radio so that you could help your images to make some sense. Later on, things like television began to come in, and then suddenly you had phones, iPhones. Oh God, what are they? And then iPads and computers, of course, whipped in there. And all of this technology has changed in a very short time and continues to change. So much, by the way, that even manufacturers don't want to keep the old style of engaging with older ideas about how computers should be, how you should use DVDs or CDs and all the rest of it. They're moving into streaming, and they're, as a matter of fact, new computers don't even have the ability to do anything other than stream, unless you try to acquire the tools to do so. This is just not abnormal in the scheme of things, but in the scheme of relating to and judging a relationship with how a person conceives their particular spiritual development. Oh, this is pretty interesting, because some of the older ways of engaging have very well-defined definitions about what describes a spiritual person. And there are those who become very good at assessing these things, even they're not very highly developed. They may be somewhat developed in some areas, but they judge everyone who doesn't have their way of looking at things. This is not uncommon. This is natural and normal, and not to be negated. This is just part of our vulnerability, part of our self-defense structure. In the old traditions, often people talked about perceiving the soul of another, actually perceiving where love and the material plane touch. In India, that's considered to be highly touted and unreasonably perhaps, or reasonably perhaps, considered to be quite beyond natural, normal spiritual development. Yet there are those in India who can do this quite easily and are not interested in anything that relates to the six senses or five senses. More interested in engaging at the soul level, which is often related to being fairly empty inside for the purpose of being able to watch the flow of energy. Watching meaning perceive, because perceptions get all mixed up in this. This is not a new idea. This is an idea that has been recognized for quite a long period of time, where in the brain, seeing and hearing and sensing all gets mixed up, and there is even a name for it. It doesn't come to mind right now. God, it's been a while since I've read that kind of material. But when you're perceiving a relationship with another being sitting inside of you, unknown to them, You are better to keep quiet about that in our world, because that's weird. However, if you are noticing that they have emotional type of frequencies around them that are related to a continuum, which could be very, very, very subtle, but appears at a certain frequency that you consider to be less spiritual, you may not understand that there's a whole different continuum of frequencies of color than what you have been able to understand so far. Assessments and judgments are natural in a normal human being. It is normal for us to consider things relative to the information or perception that we have. So this is not about negating those perceptions. It's about understanding that there are broader perceptions. And sometimes we lose originating perceptions so we can move into broader perceptions. It's quite interesting. This business of spiritual growth is very fascinating, but it doesn't follow a natural inclination, some sort of coordinated system that must be followed. Otherwise, things are not spiritual. But this is how we think here on these planes. And this is just early thinking, and it's allowed to be that way until eventually it's not quite that same way. In this question, however, whatever it says, perhaps it is personally related since this growth holding a dynamic of movement towards something, some goal. But what the dilemma is, concern about not being in these places and judgments on that as if it were a shortcoming of some kind. It's not a shortcoming. It's a place where you are. And that place where you are holds many adventures, many things to be learned in those particular places. It is comforting for us to hold strongly to fixed ideas so that we don't feel uncomfortable. So in personality trait assessments, for example, if someone is angry when you meet them, then you never see them again, you remember what they were like when you met them. When you next meet them, you have an expectation. You intensify, transmit energy to them in a kind of a way that, unknown to you and them, formulates a kind of intensity that makes them feel more defensive in those moments. They become more reflexively defensive. They're not in charge of that. They have an early warning system internally, profoundly important in our world. So they are literally engaging with you, and you are literally engaging with them. They're in you and you're in them. The issue is you're thinking that they're angry and you're looking for it. You're basically not really provoking it, but your reflexive system is aligned in that manner so that you can anticipate the occurrence of that thing, that particular way. They may think that every time they see you, they tend to be uptight and upset inside and don't know why. Therefore, they would think that you're a very upsetting person, while you're saying she or he is a very angry person. The subtlety of this lies underneath these emotional reflexive characteristics that are natural in our world, not to be negated. They're natural for an individual who has to protect themselves naturally in our world, the same as all of us do, in a kind of a way that relates directly to the reflexes that we have learned along the way. And if we don't know those reflexes, we will be vulnerable somehow, or we don't act them out, we'll be vulnerable somehow. So we anticipate and act out prior to the need, which is kind of a very helpful reflex if there is real danger. If there isn't, they're very supportive reflexes towards the assessment. The assessment itself that may be there is protected. Therefore, it is fascinating that another person falls into that particular rendering. I used to say, if you haven't seen your parents and you've been living in Paraguay, and then you come home after 20 years, your parents will anticipate that you will be similar to the last time that they saw you. And this is without any doubt most natural in our world. And you will tend all of a sudden to be acting like you were 20 years ago, not being as you were 20 years ago, but not having eradicated that. No need to eradicate that. You've moved on. Now you're someone slightly different than you were then. It's a very interesting thing with respect to goal orientations. I would have to think that goal orientation is not related to spirituality, but engagement with how you are functioning and leaving room to function differently, which is not so simple, is related deeply to a relationship with spiritual development. You know, beliefs are important. They touch on some of the comfort zones that make us feel as if we're doing the right thing somehow. That's why there are large groups in our world with respect to spiritual growth, various ones, and thinking quite differently. But the core of all of these groups is related to higher states. And that's the thing that is really important in spiritual development. The fact that each and every person has a rendering of higher state operating through them related to love, as I've mentioned before. This concept of love is related then directly to maintaining how you believe you have to be maintained to be valuable in your own eyes. Until you can look at you and not negate you, but say, oh my goodness, I just saw something I don't necessarily agree with in how I function. Instead of beating that side of you up, that's just a part of you. And if you soften it down and engage with it more gently, then what you're doing is increasing your capability of noticing it more often and practicing being softer with that part, being respectful to it, but not necessarily aligning with it. It takes some practice, but once you start to do this, it's not about then bringing out the big guns of idealistic behavior. It's about becoming a perceiver. In the old traditions, they called it a seer. In other words, you begin to be willing to allow yourself to see the frailties in you without negating, and you becoming a helper for you, you loving you enough to be attempting to help you. It's not going to be 100%. 100% isn't the goal. There's no goal there, but continuing to be helpful and respectful, you begin to acknowledge and recognize that others are doing the same thing or not, But if they're not able to yet. That doesn't necessarily need to have a judgment of them. You just realize that they may have not begun that kind of interaction with higher state loving. See, higher state loving allows you to do exactly what you do. You're the one who's working through you. The second you begin to notice that inside yourself, and notice that when you do engage, that you're in and through an engagement before you even realize how you engaged. And you don't realize that often we're on automatic. Our internal reflexes are automatic because we have certain image structures that we appreciate more than others. If you feel that you're more important than somebody else, then that somebody else becomes everybody else. The dilemma with that is that you need to do that because you're so vulnerable. You haven't realized that it's not a flaw, it's a vulnerability. And you can help your vulnerability by slowing down that previous need. But unfortunately, it's already constructed. We all have those kinds of things. Tell me you've never assessed anybody else verbally, internally, or externally, to yourself or to others, because of something you think should be different. This just allows you to elevate yourself and be kind of fluffy and important onto yourself. Yeah, sure, that's true. But it's because somewhere along the line in there, you are vulnerable. You need this kind of thing that you do, that you've practiced in your life, unknown to you or known to you, because it's made you feel somehow more content with being you. That is not a put down. That's a recognition, a realization. For many years, they used to talk about this higher interaction with higher states as realization. Nobody understood what it meant. The realization that you are a human being doing human things imperfectly and suggestively better than some others who are doing things imperfectly. And two imperfects don't make a right or a wrong. They just make it what they are. So when you take a look at trying to allow yourself to engage in a manner that would help you to help yourself, basically what you're really saying is, help me to understand this form that I've constructed for for living life and engaging with people and being respectful to others. Yeah, fine. And protecting myself when I need it, and being able to function within other states as well, and allowing myself to pull back from what I think has to be to watching how it is. It is very difficult to be honest with yourself. It's much easier to be engaged with protecting whatever it is you need to protect, so that you value something. That value, once again, as well, is needed, because if you find yourself being not valuable inside, it makes you really feel awkward and frustrated. It's a very interesting thing. We have another question from Serge Pinot. After you have experiences, either physical, emotional, or mental, that are spiritual of a kind, there is sometimes a missing, an emptiness that comes after that. It's as if the whole system, I won't call it, maybe we'll be in a little tiny bit of a shock. Not quite that, but it's an inclination, meaning this. Where did that go? Where did that moment go that was right there, emotionally, mentally, or physically? I felt wondrously involved with that flow and then empty. In that transition moment right there, it gives you a clue to how internal workings actually occur sometimes. I won't say all the time, I'm saying sometimes. Because you will have an inflow of that love, that wondrous engagement with different sensing than what you're used to. And you'll have it there for a little while, and then suddenly you'll feel as if you're empty or vulnerable because you want to go back, but you don't have the means because your natural tendency is to get back into what you've been practicing before, because that's the zone that helps you to be comforted in your relationship with life. There's a cultivation of a trust over time in that empty area. It's a quiet area. We define it because we don't know what it is. It can be a very quiet area for a moment or two. When we're feeling vulnerable, it's uncomfortable. When we're feeling less vulnerable, it's very calming because there's nothing that enters into it, except there's a vulnerability that can enter into it where it's not like you were before. And quite understandably, you are literally missing two things. Number one, you're missing how you were before, number one. But then number 1A is you're missing that moment of realization of something so different or slightly even different. Sometimes there can be a slight difference. It's almost like there's an immediate pause where there's nothing there. And you notice the pause. You actually noticing that empty or that pause helps you to be, over time, more able to be able to watch how you function with no negation. And this is very valuable. Or not judge, or not react, or not do the normal thing that would be expected for you to do so that you could get yourself back into the natural rhythm of how you normally function and have been normally functioning most of your life. This is a form, remember, that we constructed from the time of our birth for the purpose of being able to engage with life. And you will not lose it. You just will use it differently. And at moments when you need to, if you're under some kind of personal attack, you may find out that you can have those particular defensive systems back in a nanosecond. And they haven't gone anywhere. They're just there, waiting to be called upon for their use because they've been constructed for use. Also, in our unconscious reflex moments, they're also there for activity, literally, that would be natural and normal from our point of view. If you're not used to watching these things occur, they'll be there just naturally and normally, activated for the purpose of function, period, because that's why they were created. I won't go into the construction mechanisms of that because I've done that so often, but if you ever want to know more about that, just ask, and I can try and do it from a different perspective. I hope that helps, Serge and Bronwyn. There's another one from Natalie. I think in a kind of a way, very similar, and often questions are very similar because it's an indication that people are actually growing internally. We are trained to monitor based on our reflex reactions. And well trained, by the way, through schooling and judgment about who's better and what's right and what's wrong and what should be and all the rest of it. And yeah, man, there's some merit in these things. Otherwise, we wouldn't be using them over long periods of time the way we do. But when you're growing internally, you're trying to cultivate, as I said before, a view, a willingness to be able to watch and judge less, notice the judging and pull back from it a little bit. Because watching doesn't have to go along with judgment. Doesn't have to go along with needing to be more right or more wrong or more this, more that, whatever. The seeing itself is cultivating an ability to allow another angle of entry of a mind, emotion, or physical structure to engage with a life. And as I said, there's no goal there. It's not a matter of getting everything idealistically perfect, because you'll come up against all kinds of rules and regulations about the ideal this and the ideal that. Usually I'm talking about personality and personal. And this is not an act I'm talking about. It's an engagement with what's real inside. And that one can be uncomfortable, but doesn't have to be as uncomfortable. But our vulnerabilities to bringing up the rules fairly strong. And therefore, we succeeded in doing this. We did not succeed in doing that. And that justifies this or justifies that. No. It all is life. Seeing it slightly differently helps us to understand ourselves better. And once we do that, we all of a sudden realize that if we're like that, if we honestly are like that, it's provided you allow yourself to notice that you're actually a human being. Most people go for lower than human or superior to the mundane human being stuff. If you can actually allow yourself to realize that you are a human being, then you are constructed in a form to survive here and to engage here, to do well here, to be happy here. But take a look at your happy definitions, and you will find that happy definitions are often in accord with the music of your background, how you've been engaged with in terms of teaching from the early moments of your life. None of it negative, just method, structure, formula, value, presentation, response, unconscious, conscious. But most wonderful to know this, it's exciting, and also to be okay with being happy in a place where normally you're not. Just seeing something from a different perspective. Okay, here's one from Natalie. The solar plexus has been pretty touchy for the last few weeks. This is written, I think, last week, especially for a few hours in the afternoon. There seems to be a connection to more energy moving around in the head area that then provokes a reaction from the solar plexus, like feeling seasick. She goes on. I was going to try and explain that, but let me try. Doing any of the energy work then gets involved in an activity and it helps. But then at some point, it's as if the activity has gone on for too long and the solar plexus feeling comes back. It's like it requires a series of course corrections. Yeah, could be. I'm not fully complete with this. Could be, but another way to look at it is, you've heard me talk about the construction of our form. One of the major chakras or centers or Sephiroth that is involved with bringing energy out into the world and into our engagement with life is the solar plexus. If we shift something in our personality, the solar plexus that is constructed in being activated in a certain way to help you to remain that way begins to have a response internally, and it shifts a bit inside, and it sometimes can make you feel a little bit nauseous or a lot nauseous because you're doing something different with the energy that comes in to be the way you were, and now you're shifting it to move it into a different way of engaging with this world. And you're attempting to do this consciously. When you attempt to do this consciously, energy will come in through that same area to help you to be more conscious. Remember, energy follows thought, action, engagement, reflex, reaction, anything, emotion, any kind. And it is there to provoke a similar act. You do one thing often enough, it becomes a particular way of doing things. It follows your movement, your intent, your wish. And it can be conscious or unconscious, of course. So it will move physically even because your body is energy. That flow is energy. Those chakras are energy, or valves. They're energy. And when you set yourself up and then you bring yourself to a little shift and there's something working there, then there's a reflex that occurs. And that reflex is to bring that shift into that structure so that new perceptions can be occurring more often, broadening out, so that you can allow yourself to help yourself better, because your awareness, conscious awareness, is suddenly there in that area. Or if you were very defensive and didn't want to do that, then you would be defending against anything changing, and you would try to stick to the glue that was already there previously. This is just normal and natural. It's not negative at all. This is just how it works. So great stuff. If that occurs, makes you feel a bit vulnerable. Well, at the end of meditation, I found out that David, her partner, David Sakeley, had the same experience. For some reason, that switched my feelings to a sense of love and gratitude, and the solar plexus was at ease. Yeah, because you're not alone. You're not the only one. And believe me, no matter how will ever happen, others have had it happen before in their journey on that spiritual pathway to engage with states different than the ones that have been constructed currently, or to meet certain ways of being the way you should be, whatever it may be. Also, at this time, all of this seems to be connected. Now, it's easier to prolong a negative state than it is to stay with more relaxed, positive states of mind. You understand what she's saying there, that if she has some reactions she's used to having, it's easier to stay there than it is to move into a different kind of way of seeing the world. Trust is a big issue in all of our growing. And this trust is learning how to be okay with trusting from a different perspective, a growing you rather than an older rendering of how that had to be or should be. And I was wondering if that's because a negative state is related to defending, and the open, relaxed state, even though it feels better, is less defended, and it's hard to be comfortable there for very long. Well, in a kind of a way, that may be true, but as you go along, you will also defend that new place just as easily, because we are reflexively taught to defend whatever characteristics that are constructed within us, and be they the older ones or some newer ones or fused interactions that work together in a different way in our personalized form. I'm not sure if I could add anything to that. Let's see. What I would suggest is don't focus on doing better, I'm doing better, I'm doing worse, I'm doing this. Try to say, okay, this is part of the cycle of growing, the cycle of engaging with other states. If I move to a different city, I will have a sense of vulnerability if I don't know how to go about making friends and finding a place to live and looking for areas that would be comfortable for me to be in, close to my job, or, these kinds of things. It's like we're shifting and moving, and we need to be patient with that. It's patient meaning remind yourself that it's not about a goal orientation, it's about movement, slow, progressive movement. And if the best you can, trying not to assess what kind of growth you have, because if your perception is at a certain level, close to your personality's orientation, you're not going to be able to perceive the internal growing process. But little by little, that level of perception opens a little bit and allows you to perceive something quite different through experience, through understanding, yes, but through experience. And that means experience on all planes, your physical, your emotional, your mental planes, and also your personality's interaction with other people, because that as well is a fusion or a conglomerate related to images and belief constructs that you've had, and you move in and out of those, just like a frog moving from lily pad to lily pad. And we do this quite suggestively all the time. Let's see if I put anything else down here. Excuse me. I did say try the best you can to teach yourself to be comforted by small perceptions of things. Okay, that's helpful. That means, okay, that makes some sense to me. Okay, and there's movement there. You'll be in and out of that, and the more you practice that movement, the stronger it'll get. And you'll see things from a different perspective. Be okay. If you begin to see your friends as if they're not perfect, that'll be helpful. Why? Because it'll indicate that you're seeing yourself as a person who is not perfect, but is a very okay, functional being and worthy of your comfort and your kindness. And no need to be resentful or negative towards you at all, or any of the past. It's difficult to understand that, but nonetheless, it does touch you from time to time. Remember the movie state the best you can. Soften the judgments. And one thing, even though we are very, very good at defending small changes, and you begin to notice that you're not defending as much in the same places. And I emphasize in the same places. You may shift to other places because you're not as vulnerable in some places like you used to be. But in any event, the defense is natural on our planes. All of these things are natural. The only thing is learning how to be okay with you and understanding you and moving forward is not as natural. For some, it seems to be a lot easier, but inside of them, they may not be as easy. They may be. Being okay with being you and learning how to really care for you, love you, and respect, and try to honor first attempts, 156,000th attempts, even if you fail at something. Being okay with trying again is very valuable. I think now we're going to move to meditating. And thank you very much. Got a frog in my throat, maybe two. Marlene's going to set us up here. And now we'll begin to do the balancing on your own. And have a good evening.